There's a moment most people don't talk about. Not the obvious struggles, not the big, visible failures, but that quiet point in your life where things stop adding up, where you sit back and wonder why your path has felt so different from everyone else. You look around and see people moving in straight lines, clear direction, predictable outcomes. And then there's your journey, full of detours, pauses, sudden shifts, and experiences that didn't seem to connect at the time. And maybe lately, something has been changing. Not externally in a dramatic way, but internally. Subtle realizations, a different kind of awareness, a sense that pieces of your past are starting to click into place in a way they never did before. It's not loud, it's not overwhelming, but it's there. And if you felt that, then this conversation might help you understand why. Because sometimes, clarity doesn't come all at once. It builds quietly, until one day you realize you're no longer confused about who you are. The weight of experiences that didn't make sense. There were moments in your life that felt unnecessary. Situations that seemed unfair, confusing, or even random. You might have asked yourself more than once, why did I have to go through that? Not everything felt like a lesson when it was happening. Some experiences just felt like chaos, like interruptions to the life you thought you were supposed to have. You may have dealt with people who misunderstood you, situations where your intentions were clear to you, but not to others, times when you felt out of place, even in environments where you were expected to fit in. And over time, that creates a kind of internal tension. Because when your experiences don't align with your expectations, your mind keeps searching for meaning. It keeps trying to connect dots that don't seem to connect. That's exhausting. But here's what often goes unnoticed. Not everything is meant to make sense immediately. Some experiences are too early to understand when you're inside them. They require distance, growth, a different version of you. And that version of you is starting to form now. Why you felt out of sync with others. At some point, you probably realized you don't process things the same way as most people around you. Maybe you noticed it in conversations, the way you think deeper about things others brush off, the way certain environments drain you while others seem comfortable there. It's not about being better or worse. It's about being wired differently. And when you're wired differently, the world doesn't always feel like it's built for you. You may have tried to adjust, to blend in, to follow the same patterns that seem to work for everyone else, but something about it never felt fully right. Because deep down, you weren't just reacting to life. You were observing it, analyzing it, trying to understand not just what was happening, but why it was happening. That level of awareness can feel isolating at first, but over time, it becomes one of your strongest advantages. Because while others move on quickly from experiences, you extract meaning from them. And meaning is what eventually creates clarity. The hidden pattern behind your setbacks. When you look back, your setbacks might seem scattered. Different situations, different people, different outcomes. But if you slow down and really examine them, there's usually a pattern underneath. Maybe it was learning when to trust your instincts. Maybe it was recognizing environments that don't align with you. Maybe it was understanding your own boundaries, or the lack of them at certain points. At the time, each situation felt separate. But now something shifts. You start to see repetition, not in the exact events, but in the underlying themes. And that's where things begin to make sense. Because repetition isn't random. It's often how life brings your attention to something you haven't fully understood yet. Not as punishment, not as pressure, but as a process of refinement. And once you recognize the pattern, you stop seeing those experiences as isolated problems and start seeing them as connected lessons. The shift from reaction to awareness. There's a clear difference between reacting to life and understanding it. Earlier in your journey, you may have been more reactive. Situations would happen, and you'd respond based on emotion, instinct, or immediate pressure. That's normal, but something has been changing. Now, instead of immediately reacting, you pause more. You think more. You observe not just what's happening, but how it's affecting you internally. That shift might seem small on the surface, but it's actually one of the most important transitions you can go through. Because awareness creates space, and in that space, you gain control. You start choosing your responses instead of defaulting to them. You start seeing people more clearly, not just through their words, but through their patterns. And most importantly, you start seeing yourself more clearly. Your triggers, your strengths, your growth. That's when things begin to feel different. Not easier, but clearer. When your past starts to connect, there comes a point where your past stops feeling like a collection of random moments and starts feeling like a sequence. Not perfectly planned, not perfectly logical, but connected. You begin to understand why certain relationships didn't last, why certain opportunities didn't work out, why some paths closed even when you wanted them to stay open. And instead of frustration, there's a different feeling. Recognition. Because now you can see things you couldn't see before. You can see how certain situations pushed you to develop parts of yourself you might have ignored otherwise. You can see how discomfort forced growth, how confusion led to deeper understanding, and how everything that once felt like a setback played a role in shaping how you think today. That doesn't mean everything was easy. It means everything had impact. The identity shift you didn't notice at first. Growth isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it happens so gradually that you don't notice it until you look back. The way you think now is not the way you thought before. The way you handle situations now is not how you handled them in the past. Even the things you value have likely changed. What used to feel important might not carry the same weight anymore. And what you once overlooked might now feel essential. That's not confusion. That's evolution. Because identity isn't fixed. It adapts based on experience, reflection, and awareness. And what you're experiencing now is a shift into a more grounded version of yourself. Not driven by impulse, not shaped by external pressure, but built through understanding. If things are starting to make more sense lately, if you've been connecting pieces of your past in a way you couldn't before, then you're not going backwards. You're integrating. And integration is what turns experience into clarity. Not everything needed to make sense when it happened. But now that you've grown into a different perspective, you're finally able to see it differently. And that changes everything. If this resonated with you, take a moment and reflect on what part of your past is starting to make more sense now. You don't have to explain it perfectly. Just notice it. Because sometimes, that awareness alone is a sign of how far you've come, when you stop chasing what doesn't fit. At some point, something inside you got tired. Not physically, but mentally. Tired of trying to force things to work. Tired of adjusting yourself to fit into situations that never fully aligned. Tired of over-explaining who you are just to be understood in spaces that weren't built for you. And that shift didn't happen overnight. It was gradual. It came from repeated moments where you gave your energy and didn't get the same clarity in return, where you tried to make something stable that kept showing signs of instability, where you ignored your own instincts just to maintain peace or avoid change. But eventually, you reached a point where continuing like that felt heavier than letting go. That's when something important happened. You stopped chasing. Not in a dramatic way, not with anger, but with awareness. You started recognizing the difference between effort and force. Effort feels natural, it has flow. Even when it's challenging, it doesn't drain your sense of self. Force, on the other hand, feels like resistance, like constantly pushing against something that doesn't move with you. And once you felt that difference clearly, you can't unsee it. That's why certain things you used to tolerate no longer feel acceptable. It's not that you've become difficult. It's that you've become aware of what fits and what doesn't. The quiet confidence that replaces validation. There was a time when external validation mattered more. Not because you were weak, but because you were still figuring things out. You were still learning how to measure your own progress, your own worth, your own direction. So naturally, you looked outside. For approval, for reassurance, for confirmation that you were on the right path. And sometimes you got it. But other times you didn't. And those moments likely affected you more than you expected. They made you question yourself, made you wonder if you were missing something, if you needed to change more than you already had. But over time, something shifted. You started noticing that external validation isn't always consistent. People see through their own perspectives, their own limitations, their own experiences. So waiting for everyone to understand you or approve of your direction became less realistic. And slowly, almost quietly, you began to rely less on that. Not because you stopped caring completely, but because you started trusting your own judgment more. That's where a different kind of confidence comes from. Not loud, not performative, but steady. It doesn't need constant reinforcement. It doesn't depend on how others respond. It comes from knowing you've thought things through, from understanding your own patterns, from learning through experience rather than just reacting to opinions. And once that kind of confidence starts forming, it changes how you move. You become less reactive, less easily influenced, more grounded. Why solitude started to feel different. There was likely a time when being alone felt uncomfortable. Not necessarily because you feared it, but because it gave you too much space to think, too much time to reflect, too many unanswered questions. So you filled that space. With noise, with distractions, with people, with constant movement. But something changed. Now, solitude doesn't feel the same. It feels clearer. Not always easy, but clearer. Because instead of avoiding your thoughts, you've started understanding them. Instead of running from reflection, you've started using it. You've realized that, when you remove the noise, you can actually hear yourself think without interference. And that's powerful. Because clarity rarely comes from constant activity. It comes from stillness. From giving yourself the space to process what you've experienced, without immediately trying to escape it. That's why solitude now feels less like isolation and more like alignment. The way you see people has shifted. Another change you may have noticed is how you perceive others. Not in a judgmental way, but in a more aware way. You pick up on patterns faster. You notice inconsistencies between words and actions. You recognize when someone is speaking from clarity and when they're speaking from confusion. And this isn't about overanalyzing. It's about pattern recognition. Because after everything you've experienced, your mind naturally starts connecting behaviors, outcomes, and intentions. You've seen enough to know that what people say isn't always the full picture. And because of that, you've become more selective. Not closed off, just intentional. You don't invest energy as quickly. You don't ignore red flags as easily. And you don't feel the need to convince people to understand you anymore. Because you've realized something important. The right connections don't require constant explanation. They have a level of mutual understanding that feels natural, not forced. When growth feels like disconnection. One of the more difficult parts of this process is something people don't talk about enough. Growth can feel like disconnection, not because you're losing people in a negative way, but because you're changing in ways that don't always align with your previous environment. You may feel like you're in between versions of yourself, not who you used to be, but not fully settled into who you're becoming either. And that space can feel uncertain, because familiarity is comfortable even when it's limiting. And growth requires stepping outside of that. So naturally, there's a period where things feel unfamiliar, where conversations don't feel as engaging as they once did, where certain environments feel out of place, where your priorities shift, but not everyone around you shifts with you. That's not a failure. That's transition. And transition is rarely comfortable. But it's necessary, because you can't evolve while staying fully attached to every version of your past. At some point, something has to change. And that change often starts internally, before it becomes visible externally. The clarity that comes without announcement. Not every realization needs to be shared. That's another shift you may have experienced. There was a time when you felt the need to explain your growth, to articulate your realizations, to express every shift in perspective as it happened. But now it's quieter. You understand things without needing to broadcast them. You make decisions without needing constant feedback. You adjust your direction without announcing every step. That's not secrecy. That's self-trust. Because when clarity becomes internal, it doesn't need external confirmation to feel real. You just know. And that kind of knowing is different. It's stable. It doesn't fluctuate based on opinions. It doesn't disappear when things get uncertain. It stays with you because it's built on experience, not assumption. You're not starting over, you're seeing clearly. Sometimes it might feel like you're starting from scratch. Like everything you thought you understood is being reevaluated. But that's not actually what's happening. You're not starting over. You're seeing clearly. There's a difference. Starting over implies loss. Clarity implies understanding. You're not losing your past. You're finally understanding it. You're seeing how everything connects. How every experience added something, even if it didn't feel that way at the time. And once you see that clearly, you move differently. Not rushed. Not pressured. But intentional. Because now, your decisions aren't just based on what you want in the moment. They're based on what you've learned over time, if things are beginning to make more sense. If your past feels less confusing and more connected. If your present feels quieter but more grounded. Then you're in a different phase now. Not one defined by constant searching, but one shaped by understanding. And understanding doesn't always come with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly and changes everything without needing to announce itself.